This is section 4, lecture 2. We're still talking about foreign policy decision-making models, and in this lecture we're going to be talking about the rational choice model. This is the first model that is described and put forward by Graham Allison in his work Conceptual Models in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We will talk about the organizational process model and the bureaucratic politics model in separate lectures. So what does this mean? Rational policy model. What is a rational decision? The outcome of this, or the idea of this, is based on this question. How could the government of the United States choose a policy logically based on objective cost-benefit analysis? How could it weigh the costs and benefits of different options and then choose the one that best fits the situation that they face, regardless of other instances, regardless of the past? And the assumption is that our leaders and their decisions can be seen in this rational way, that the leaders of nation states and the decisions that they make are rational. They are utility maximizing. This imposes a rational line on an event despite the history, despite the leader, despite the nation, and despite the ideology of the leader. The outcome is that governments select the policy that maximizes the benefit of their nation state's goals and minimizes the cost or the consequences of this outcome to the nation state. If we put this into the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we see then that XCOM came up with a set of perceived options and the goals of the nation state in this given situation. The first goal was the missiles out of Cuba, the second to avoid war, the third to demonstrate resolve, to stand up for ourselves. And the options that were presented in the rational choice model then are selected based on these goals. Which of these best fits, best solves the problem at hand and best achieves the goals that are stated? We'll make this comparison after we look at the tenets of the rational actor model. The rational actor model assumes that a nation state can be seen as a unitary decision maker. Your textbook defines unitary actors as this: a model of national decision making that assumes that a foreign policy makers act in a united fashion to make decisions in the name of the national interest, a central tenet of realist theory. The decisions that are made not based on any personal influence or personal belief, but all people involved, and ultimately the final decision is an abstract view, an objective view of what the national interest is in a given situation. And this assumes then that the leaders and nation states have a set of goals, values, or preferences that are in rank order It assumes that they have one set of perceived options. It assumes that they have a single set of estimated consequences. If we think about the list on the previous slide, in this situation, XCOM comes up with a set of goals based on the national interest in this given situation, and a set of perceived options to deal with them. The foreign policy action that is chosen is one in response to or based on the strategic problem at hand only, regardless of history, regardless of leader, regardless of ideology. What they seek is the greatest outcome that can be achieved based on the nation's goals, its options, and the perceived consequences. In this model, there is an assumption that the options are static or set, that you can't do one or the other, or half of one and half of the other. There's also an assumption that there is no dynamic stream, that is, there's no changing your options midstream. Once a decision is made, you stick with it. The outcome of this is that the foreign policy action is a rational choice. The goals and values of the action are in the national interest only. The options lead to courses of actions that are relevant to dealing with the problem at hand. There's an estimated set of consequences based on cost-benefit analysis. And so the choice that is made, the rational choice, is one that is value maximizing. That is, that will serve the nation and its interest the best, that will solve the problem at hand the best. And this is then the decision that will ultimately be made. It assumes that the national foreign policy is made by an objective, abstract, unitary actor, and is made in this way absent history and those influences, or personality, regardless of ideology, so on and so forth. Let's look again at our options presented by XCOM and the goals presented by XCOM. The number one goal was the desire to have the missiles out of Cuba. Which options tick off this goal? Well, do nothing does nothing. It doesn't achieve any of the goals, and so it was stricken. What does the diplomatic approach do? Does it get the missiles out of Cuba? Maybe, if the Cubans and the Soviets can be dealt with. Does it avoid war? Yes. Does it demonstrate resolve? Kind of, not really. Does it topple Castro? Probably not. What about a secret threat to Castro? Split with the Soviet Union or fall to the United States. Does it get the missiles out of Cuba? Maybe. Does it avoid war? Maybe. Does it demonstrate resolve? Only to Castro, not the Soviet Union. Does it topple Castro? No, it doesn't. What about an invasion of Cuba? Does it get the missiles out? Well, assuming that they're not operationally ready, maybe they can be destroyed. But if they are operationally ready, they'll be fired before the army gets to them. Does this avoid war? No. Does it demonstrate resolve? Yes. Does it topple Castro? Yes. What about a surgical airstrike on the missile sites? Does it get the missiles out? Assuming yes, yet in hindsight we know that's not true. Does it avoid war? No, it's an act of war. Does it demonstrate resolve? Yes. Does a surgical airstrike topple Castro? No. What about the naval blockade? Does it get the missiles out? No. Does it avoid war? Maybe. Does it demonstrate resolve? Yes. Does it topple Castro? No. If we look in the context, the historical context discussed in Lecture 1, initially the options that were given that would address these goals were the surgical airstrike, the naval blockade, and then an invasion later if necessary. Well, these all speak to the primary goal of having the missiles out of Cuba, and they speak to that third goal of demonstrating resolve, but they totally ignore the second goal of avoiding war and a potential escalation to nuclear war. As you look at the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, diplomacy was used, secrecy was used, naval blockade was used, and ultimately the invasion and the airstrikes were not, because the second goal is also very important. Remember, the goals in a rational decision are in rank-ordered preference. So avoiding war is more important than demonstrating resolve and toppling Castro. One of the issues with assuming rationality in a decision making is that the outcomes oftentimes don't fulfill the perceived national interest. The outcomes are oftentimes negative, and that is because the true objectivity, the true rationality of a decision is bounded by certain things. Your textbook defines bounded rationality as a decision-making environment characterized by an influx of more information that can be managed effectively, leading to policy decisions that do not fully conform to the standards of rationality. We need to augment that definition a bit. It's not characterized just by an influx of more information. It is also characterized by the lack of information. What binds the decisions that you make or anybody else makes that might otherwise be fully rational? Time. Particularly in a crisis situation, you have to act, and you have to act fast. In this case, the U.S. felt it had to act before the missile sites on Cuba were operational. Information. You're always going to be limited or bound in the level of information that you have. Nobody has a full understanding of any given situation. Perceived options. You could ask yourself, are you missing something? Are the options that are presented to you the best? Perceived consequences. If you're limited in time and you're limited in information, then you may be limited in the assumptions that you make about the consequences of your actions and how others will react. And in this way, rational decisions can be made, but they're still bound. Maybe the decision maker doesn't get their ultimate desire, what ultimately they want as a goal. They have to get what is best given the context, given the time, given the information. You can still go through a cost-benefit analysis, but it's going to bind the decision that you make, and ultimately may lead to a failure or a bad decision, at least in hindsight. But in the process, as long as you are weighing the costs and benefits and choosing that decision which benefits you the best, then you are making the better decision. There's a table in your book that explains the assumptions of rationality versus what happens in the real world. And as we look at these different models of decision making in the next two lectures, and we look at the next lecture, which talks about failures of rationality, you'll see then this table come to life. Rational action assumes like-minded decision makers, a unitary decision. It assumes objectivity. It assumes a high level of information. It assumes a high level of efficiency. All of these things don't necessarily exist in the real world. And this is what the next three lectures is going to look at. The organizational process model talks about the influence of bureaucracies. The bureaucratic politics model talks about the influence of personality. And then in the final lecture of this section, we're going to talk about psychological barriers to rational decisions.